Okay, so in lesson 2, we were talking about the idea of the just how we got the Old Testament in general, and we looked at and saw that there were 3 different places where the Old Testament text was introduced again to Israel. And the first and most important one that we covered was when Moses received the text on Mount Sinai. And we went into this a little bit last week, but the reason that Moses is most important is that if you take Moses out of the picture, if Moses is not, as the world would have you to believe in some cases, if Moses is not the writer of the first 5 books of the Bible, then it undermines everything that is in the Bible. The creation story, all of the prophecies on the coming of the Christ, everything is in there. So that's why there has been so much interest amongst the secular world and Satan in general in just trying to take Moses down. But we see there's just too much evidence, too much factual evidence that make it so that we can understand and believe that Moses is the first inspired writer that we have. And so right here, just to summarize the Moses part of this, first of all, you got to go back to Jewish tradition. The Jews themselves believe that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. They always have believed that. They said it many times, and that is the way that they have looked at it from the beginning. You can see also that in many places in the Old Testament, there, and we name 6 of them right here, where it says literally, Moses wrote this. Moses was told to write that. And over again. And then we have, of course, other Bible writers that credit Moses. Joshua credits Moses and he knew Moses. And so we all of these, and we have Ezra also right there. And then this is important. Moses started a pattern. The pattern, God is all about patterns to help us to make it more simple for us to understand his will. And so if you would turn over to Joshua 24 and verse 26, and you'll see an instance of the pattern there. And whoever gets that first, go ahead and we'll read that. Joshua 24 and verse 26.
Then Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak tree that was by the sanctuary of the Lord.
Okay, so you notice 2 things in there. Up until this point, the book of the law of God, it would say Moses wrote in the book of the law of God. Moses wrote the book of the law of God. Now, Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God. There was only one of them. It was the one Moses was asked to write in back from Exodus 17 with the Amalekites all the way forward. And now we see the pattern. The new prophet, the new leader was going to be the one writing in that book. And we find from Joshua on that pattern continues with the prophets as it passes along. So, and we see that pattern complete going over and over again until it was completed during the time of Ezra. And you can see in Josephus talks about the Old Testament books being compiled from Moses through King Artaxerxes of Persia. We're going to see that quote a little bit later. But basically that is up until the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi. Nehemiah and Malachi being the last 2 inspired writers to close out the Old Testament, those 2 prophets. And so Moses is the first inspired writer. The second part comes in with during the reign of Josiah. Now, again, Moses was, you remember about when Moses was writing? Yeah, the date. 1446 is right around that area. So here we have 800 years later. 800 years later, something happened. Yeah, I've heard of people losing their keys, but we're talking about losing the law of God. And Israel had gotten to the point, and Judah had gotten to the point where they literally lost the law. Had no idea where it was, weren't looking for it, didn't even know there was one, is the whole idea in there. And of course, the problems that came along with that were inherent in the system. That was going along. You talk about being separated from God. So in the 18th year of King Josiah, the king of Judah, we have this situation that comes up. And of course, this is during the time period of Judah alone, right? Israel's already been taken away. And literally there has been no guidance. These guys are running on autopilot. Whatever feels good, the thing of the day, the idea of the day. And because there is no law of God. There, as a matter of fact, from the way Josiah is looking at this, and we're going to read this, 2 Kings, go over there to chapter 22, 2 Kings 22, and we'll read a couple of these verses so that we can get a feel for just how far things had fallen since Moses gave the law on to Joshua and into the judges. So 2 Kings 22, verses 8 through 11. Todd, could you start us with the first three verses there, and then we'll just go to Bonnie right next to you for the next three. 22, verses 8 through 11.
Then Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, who read it. Shaphan the scribe came to the king and brought back word to the king and said, Your servants have emptied out the money that was found in the house and have delivered it into the hand of the workmen who have the oversight of the house of the Lord. Moreover, Shaphan the scribe told the king, saying, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. And Shaphan read it in the presence of the king.
In verse 11.
When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes.
There's a reaction for you. Okay, Bonnie, verses 1 through 3 of chapter 23.
Okay. Then the king sent, and they gathered to him all the elders of Judah and of Jerusalem. The king went up to the house of the Lord, and all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem with him, and the priests and the prophets and all the people, both small and great. And he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which was found in the house of the Lord. The king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and with all his soul, to carry out the words of this covenant that were written in this book. And all the people entered into the covenant.
Okay, so I mean, they weren't, when they were in, you remember this incident, they went in and they're trying to get the temple cleaned up and get the stuff out of it and fix it up and everything. And they had hired workers, and they were getting the money, right, out of the temple to pay the workers for this. So they weren't even looking for this book. And then all of a sudden they find that, oh, I found a book. And what did they find? Literally. A scroll. Remember, we're still dealing with scrolls. Probably papyrus scroll at this time, although they may have started the changeover no, it's going to be a papyrus scroll for sure, because they don't start using parchment until the period of silence, or the silence of the scriptures. So anyway, you see what's happening here. Now, question 4. Is the phrase books of the law ever found in Scripture? And what does this indicate about what was brought to Josiah? Have we ever seen the phrase, the books of the law. No. They always talk about the book of the law, right? The reason is we're going to see a little bit later, that the Jews did not split up their books. They didn't title their books. They just basically, they went from one book to the next book to the next book, and on it went until they got 36 feet of scroll, and that was it. And they'd cut it off, and then you'd have to carry this thing around. Can you imagine 36 feet of papyrus rolled up, and then carrying that thing is pretty. And so there was a physical limitation there. So, yeah. So no, it's always talked about as the book of the law. If you go to 2 Kings 22 and verse 8, and you can see what it was. I found the book of the law. And that's because the first 5 books of our Bible, and their Bible is called for them the law of Moses. It's the law. And so as we look in here, you can see that 19 times in the Old Testament and once in the New Testament, and that's because it's a quotation of the Old Testament. It always talks about the book of the law. And so we have, and we're going to look at this in just a few slides from now, but we're going to, when we get into this next lesson, we're going to be talking about the Septuagint, the Greek translation, and that will have a lot to do with what we're more familiar with today. So this is some of the stuff that they would do. They would separate the books basically with 4 lines, 4 blanks, and then the next one would start, and it would just keep going. Todd?
So is your understanding that when he says book of the law, he's referring to the first 5, or is it more than that? For instance, like Joshua, he wrote it down in the book of the law.
Right.
And it's referring to things that happened after Deuteronomy was finished. So
this part right here, we don't know what other things turned up. We just know that at this point, the book of the law is what is available. We know for sure that's the first 5 books, because that's and we're going to see in a second that's what the Jews looked at as the law. So the law that they had to keep was those first 5 books, and they call it the Torah, and that is the law. The rest is historical facts. Now we look at it as inspired, and so did they. But as far as what they do, they're going to split it up into different sections: poetry, writings, and law, and the history part. And so that's why when they say the book of the law, they're talking about the first 5 books of the Bible. Just those. Now, again, what else they found in there could have been anything. If they found that in there could have been a number of other things that were also there. Another thing and this is, Josiah would have received the scroll. It could have been, they could have received scrolls and pieces of all of it. The key is it's the first 5 books of the Bible is what they're talking about. We call it the Pentateuch. They call it the Torah. It's the law. Okay, so question 5, what does the Bible say about God's ability to preserve his word? In the book, there's a couple of quotations in there, but what did you guys find on that? To let you know, from a scriptural standpoint, that God is going to preserve his word. Somebody have a scripture that they'd like to offer up, Ken?
Matthew 5, verse 18.
Okay, Matthew 5, verse 18. You want to read that?
Sure. Matthew 5, verse 18 says, "For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass away from the law till all is fulfilled."
Okay. Now here we have a Jesus quotation right here. Now these other ones, there are a number of other ones that the author looked at, and of course some other New Testament ones, plus one from the Psalms here, that all are dealing with the same kind of thing. The ability of the law of God to preserve His law and make it so that we can have it available to us no matter what. And it's an important thing, because God made a promise in here about that. And Jesus, in talking about here in verse 18, when he talks about in a jot or a tittle, or the smallest portion or smallest letter, the jot and the tittle were the smallest. What they were parts of strokes that made up letters. So we're not talking just about a letter, having a letter missing. We're talking about a stroke of a letter. That's how much of it that God is going to keep. So we had Moses gets the law. Israel loses the law. Israel finds the law again. Okay, and then 200 years later, we have this third one, which is the restoration during the time of the return from captivity. And we want to look at this one too. Go to Ezra chapter 7. Yeah, go ahead.
So Matthew chapter 5 verse 18 seems a little different than the other verses, at least the ones that are in the book, and that Jesus says that nothing will pass away until it is fulfilled. But all the other verses explicitly say that the law will endure forever. So what's the meaning of
Jesus
specifically?
Jesus was talking about his part or his role, okay, in fulfilling the law. Whereas here you're talking about the other verses, and in general you're talking about the idea of preserving all of the Word of God forever until Jesus comes back. End of time. We don't need that word anymore, because we're living with God and we're there, in that situation. So that's the difference in that case. Is one is talking about the fulfillment of the law, the other one is talking about the preservation of the law, and God kept both those promises. So right here. So Ezra chapter 7, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Whoever's got chapter 7, verse 6.
This Ezra came up from Babylon, and he was a skilled scribe in the law of Moses, which the Lord God of Israel had given. The king granted him all his requests according to the hand of the Lord his God upon him.
Okay, and verse 10.
For Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord, and to do it, and to teach statutes and ordinances in Israel.
Okay, so we had a 200-year period. They went into exile, remember, and captivity, and now this is the group of folks coming back in groups. And so now we had the Ezra, Nehemiah group coming back, and so Ezra, the reason we're giving Ezra the credit right here, along with Nehemiah and Malachi in this critical section, is because somebody needs to wrap up the old law, tie it in a bow, done. And because there's the other prophecy in Amos about, which we're going to see, about there being a stoppage period where it's going to be silent. And so we have Ezra coming on at this time, along with Nehemiah, now with the idea. And what was his attitude? What was it that Ezra was trying to do? What was his goal? Study, practice, and teach. Yeah, which is going to be critical, because let's just say in the history of Israel, they haven't done that much. Not often. and it got them in trouble with with idols. It got them in trouble with a lot of different things. But we're going to notice that they're not going to have any trouble with idols anymore. They kind of get again. They seem to be picking up on some of what's being now finally that's what's being written here. Let's go to Nehemiah 8 verses 1 through 3. Whoever's got that one. Anybody got that? Nehemiah 8, 1 through 3.
Then all the people gathered as one man at the square, which was in front of the water gate, and they asked Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had given to Israel. Then Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly of men, women, and all who could listen with understanding on the first day of the 7th month. He read it before the square, which is in front of the water gate, from early morning until midday, in the presence of men and women, those who could understand, and all the people were attentive to the book of the law.
Okay, and in verse 8, they read from the book, from the law of God, translating to give the sense so that they understood the reading. And then in verse 12, finishing up, all the people went away to eat, drink, to send portions, and to celebrate in a great festival, because they understood the words which had been made known to them. So there's a lot going on there. We talked about some of this before in another venue, as we were talking about translations associated with Aramaic and Hebrew and all that. And you can see here they had to translate for the Hebrews who were reading out of the book in Hebrew, but the Hebrews that were listening spoke Aramaic, and so they had to translate for them all that. Notice who was also in the crowd. What age level was, or maturity level was in the crowd? The crowd consisted of people who what? Who could understand, yeah. So we don't know what that age is, but we do know what the requirement was, that they could understand what was being said to them. Okay, so, and again, that varies with age. So Ezra, skilled in the law, his heart was set to study this. Of course, he's influenced this whole period of restoration. Then he was going to influence the next 400 years as it went along. And it resulted here, like Todd was saying, his goal was to preserve, teach, and then pass on to the people all of this. And so we finished, so we had the third period, and with the completion of this third period, we're going to then have to still preserve the law, right? It's still another 400 years before Jesus is going to come as the fulfillment. So the next question was, what was the great assembly or the great synagogue, and what was its purpose? And this helps us to understand that process a little bit, if we can understand what the great synagogue was all about. And this, of course, happened during the years of silence here, right? Ezra, Nehemiah, God has given, again, another way of passing on and preserving the law. So what was this great assembly in general?
Wasn't it this process we're just reading about? Where Ezra was reading the law and
They actually hadn't put the assembly together yet. Ezra and Nehemiah were going to actually pass the law on to the great assembly. But the great assembly, do you remember? Well, this is the birth of the synagogue. Okay, and you guys remember that in Jerusalem in the time of Jesus, you had the synagogue, and Nicodemus was afraid of being thrown out of the synagogue, and you had the large synagogue there in Jerusalem, which had a large number of folks, and then each of the different cities around had their own synagogues. If you had a certain number of Jews in a city, then you could have a synagogue. I can't remember what the number was. 10 males sounds right, yeah. So what this was it basically an assembly of these Jewish leaders who basically took the law and took care of it during this period of time. It started, this great synagogue, with 120 elders, according to the Jewish tradition. There were 80 prophets, and we could find the details of this all in Nehemiah chapters 9 and 10. It talks and lists and names all the names of the folks that were involved with this and everything. But it only lasted a single generation, this great synagogue, enough to set up the processes for preserving the law, and then it kind of split down into the smaller synagogues after that. In the Jewish Mishnah, which was according to the Jewish oral traditions, the Mishnah is their book of oral traditions. Moses received the Torah on Sinai, and this is the way they looked at it. Handed it down to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets handed it down to the men of the great assembly, this great synagogue. Okay, so that's how the law passed down until it got to these guys. And then this is where the end of the Old Testament, as far as the Jews were concerned, the end of the inspired writing. It ended with Malachi and Nehemiah, those prophets, and this time of Ezra, and this passing down the law to and the writings, basically. Now, this would include all the rest of it, Todd, which you were talking about, the law and all the different writings. Okay, so that now finishes up the Hebrew text section on this. Now we're going to talk about something a little bit different, and it's the Old Testament canon as we go forward here. So, what is canon? It's not a boom, not one of those. It's just a rule or a measuring line, and what it is the complete collection of all God-inspired books. Okay, and so the Hebrew Old Testament canon, what they look at when if you opened up their book, it would look like our book and be different. But it's not different in the contents, it's different in the way it's arranged. And so in essence, they're both exactly the same. They're just a different arrangement of it. And so we'll take a look at that real quick. What are the three divisions of the Hebrew Bible? Here we go. Or the Protestant Old Testament. And I'll say, and the Protestant Old Testament, because we're going to look at both of them. So let's start with the Hebrews, though. They split it into three different sections. What's the first one? Oh, go ahead, Sam. Oh,
Torah. Did you say Torah?
Gil said Torah.
I said Torah.
Oh, you said Torah. I only heard Torah, so I thought the normal. Okay, right.
Torah is the first one. What's the next one? Prophets, big category. Okay, the last one is what? They just call it the writings. It's like, what else is left to be written? So yeah, those are the three. Now here's what it looks like in a comparison with the Protestant Old Testament. Now you could see I never could see the red. Oh, there it is, right there. Okay. They combine and recombine the books in a number of interesting ways. And so, like for instance, Judges and Ruth, and Jason would tell you from our study that we did before, remember, now how do we remember where Ruth falls in? Because it comes in the time of the Judges, all right? So they literally put the two of them together. And same with Jeremiah and Lamentations. Well, Lamentations was written by Jeremiah, right? So it's the Lamentations of Jeremiah. Well, they literally put it together. They have this thing called the 12. How many minor prophets are there? You'd be right if you said 12. So they just put all the minor prophets in one book called the 12, and then they combine different things. Chronicles, First and Second Chronicles, to them it's just Chronicles. They got First and Second Kings, to them it's just Kings. Samuel, First and Second Samuel, to them it's just Samuel. And so they could have between 22 and 24 books that are in there, but they're the exact same books that you find over on this side. It's just that we put them in a different order and arrangement. Now, that's because the Greeks, the guys that wrote the Septuagint, they're the ones that, I shouldn't say the Greeks, because they actually was the Hebrews who translated it into the Greek. But over here, this was the Greek influence, basically. And the names for the books and everything came from the Greeks. So the key to remember here is that we are in complete agreement with the Hebrews, with the Jews, on what the contents of the Old Testament are, what the Old Testament canon is. We just arrange them differently. Okay? It's okay. They read right to left and up and down to up and everything too in their language. So, okay, so here's a question. What did Jesus think of the Hebrew Old Testament canon? Because it was around when he was around. So what did he think about that? And do you have any quotes that you might bring up in this particular case? Todd's got one because he's smiling at me here.
I've always really loved Luke 4:44.
Okay, go ahead and go over to Luke 24:44 and read that for us.
It says, Now I said to them, These are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled.
Now, what was he said the law, the prophets, and what else? The Psalms. Look at what the first book, the lead-off book in the writings is. Did Jesus get all three categories right? He sure did. Yeah, so Jesus thought that the Old Testament canon was complete at this time. How about Luke 11:51? From the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the temple. I always wondered about that one, the Zechariah quote. But what is he talking about there? Abel was the first martyr, right? And he was in which book? Genesis, right? And Zechariah was the last martyr of the Old Testament. And we can find his account. Let's go ahead and turn to it in 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles 24, verses 20 and 21. Whoever gets that first. Second Chronicles 24, verses 20 and 21.
The priest, and he stood above the people and said to them, Thus says God, why do you break the commandments of the Lord, so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he has forsaken you. But they conspired against him, and by command of the king they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Lord.
Wow. Exactly what Jesus was talking about there, who perished between the altar and the temple in the courtyard. Exactly right there. So, yeah, you say, well, wait a second. That's not the end of the... Genesis was the beginning, but 2 Chronicles, wait a second. That's about that far from the end of the Old Testament. So what am I missing here? Where does Chronicles fall in the Jewish Old Testament? I shouldn't say the Old Testament because it's the Jewish Bible. It's the last book. It's the last book. So he's saying everything from Genesis. Jesus is saying everything from Genesis to Zechariah, who's in the last book of their thing. Everything between there and there is what he's talking about. So again, yeah, what did Jesus think about it? Oh, he acknowledged the three sections just as they sat there. And it also proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that the time that Jesus was living, the Old Testament canon was complete. Everybody agreed these were the inspired books, okay? Now, then we have this question here. Name other ancient sources who believed the Old Testament canon was closed at the time of Christ. And what do all these sources have in common? Let's do what they have in common part. What do all the old sources that talk about this have in common? What? The three sections. Yeah, absolutely. Yep, exactly what Jesus said. Yeah, they all agree. They all agree with Jesus. Good thing to do. But they in the book they had a couple of examples. The most important one by far is Josephus, just because he's the most widely written about and read about, and we're going to have some more on him a little bit later. Right here. Okay. In his work against Appian that he wrote in 95 A.D., he's got some interesting things to say here. I just want to read some of this. Notice what he says concerning how the Jews took care of their religious books and what they thought about their religious books. Okay? And notice it says, it follows that we do not possess myriads of inconsistent books. In other words, like the Greeks do, conflicting with each other. Our books, those which are justly accredited, are but 22 and contain the record of all time. Of these, 5 are the book of Moses, comprising the laws and traditional history from the birth of man down to the death of the lawgiver. And this period falls only a little short of 3,000 years. And then from the death of Moses until Artaxerxes, the Persian. Okay, so remember, again, we talked about the time of Ezra and the Persian Empire, all that. Okay, from Moses until Artaxerxes, who succeeded Xerxes as the king of Persia, the prophets subsequent to Moses wrote the history of the events of their own times in 13 books. And the remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and precepts for the conduct of human life. Well, isn't that the list we just showed you up there? That's exactly what he's talking about. And then there's the quote, from Artaxerxes to our own time, the complete history has been written, but has not been deemed worthy of equal credit with earlier records because of the failure and exact succession of the prophets. What's he talking about there, that last sentence? From Artaxerxes to our own time, he's in 95 AD. Okay, so for almost 500 years, from Artaxerxes to our own time, the complete history has been written. In other words, other people wrote stuff about what was going on. We have the Maccabean period. We have all kinds of different things. But what was the problem? It says, but it has not been deemed worthy of equal credit with the earlier records. What were the earlier records? The canon that Jesus talked about. Exactly. It says, we have given practical proof of our reverence for our own scriptures. For although such long ages have now passed, no one has ventured either to add or to remove or to alter a syllable. And it is an instinct with every Jew from the day of his birth to regard them as the decrees of God, to abide by them, and if need be, cheerfully to die for them. Sam?
I would also argue that Paul is his own single source that argues the same thing in like Romans, for instance.
Exactly.
Like,
And Paul was Saul, right? Yeah.
so he being Jewish
He
for a
was
long time.
he would very strongly agree right now with what Josephus is saying. And why is this important? Well,
I mean, look at what he agrees with here. And we're trying to establish one step at a time the absolute validity, belief that these are the words of God, okay? The number of inspired books limited to 22, yep. The division of the inspired books into 3 sections, yep. The time of the inspiration strictly limited from Moses to Artaxerxes, yep. Agreed with the common Jewish belief that prophetic inspiration ceased with Malachi, the contemporary of Ezra and Nehemiah. And then the fact that the later writings were not inspired, not up to the standard. And so, 22 books are sacred, the decrees of God, they're authoritative, they're to be obeyed. And guess what? The early Christian writers up until the 3rd and 4th century agreed with that. And what happened at the end of the 4th century? Well, let's just say the start of the Catholic Church all happened in that area. So question, what was the Council of Jamnia? This is where we're going to start next week. And what do some of the liberal scholars seek to prove with this get-together? Now, we're going to see the same kind of thing that they did with some trying to prove Moses is not the writer of the first 5 books and all these kinds of things. The idea is we're going to make it so that the time frame for when the canon was completed is much, much later than what the Bible says it is, okay? And as a result, men in council influenced and decided what books were going to be included and what books were not going to be included. And so this is a critical one for us to understand. So this is where we're going to start next week. Thanks, guys.